I notice sometimes in my YouTube videos that I do, I notice sometimes a kind of a self-righteousness in some of the comments. Maybe I make people uncomfortable sometimes with how sort of open I am about human frailty. But like I noticed the last video that I did, and I didn't read many of the comments, and I know a lot of them were positive, but I noticed the last video I did in which I talked about failure, and I talked about Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie's marriage and what happened with their marriage and the kids, but then I used that as sort of springboard to talk about what we do with the fact that so much of our life does amount to some sort of failure, right? And there were these comments of people who were almost pissed off. You know, one woman said, "I have not failed in my life," and then she listed all the things that she had achieved and whatever. And great, yeah, I don't want anyone to look at their life as a failure, but I do find this it's kind of interesting that some people have such a resistance to admitting what I think are kind of obvious truths about flawed human nature and even our capacity for doing bad things. But anyway, or for screwing up or whatever. I want to tell you this story. So there was this guy that I knew for like a year. He was a friend of a friend when I was living in a certain place. And anyway, and I always looked at him and he just always seemed like just, I hate to use this word, but just a boring guy. You would talk to him and he was smart and everything, but it was just kind of boring conversation. He was so nice and polite and kind of quiet. And he was like one of these guys that's just too nice. And I know nice guys, they get sick of hearing stuff like that. And I'm not saying that nice itself was a problem, but this was a guy who there was nothing really in particularly like interesting or edgy or anything, right? It's nice to be around people who have like one or two edges. And this guy, everything about him just seemed like Mr. Nice. Sort of like, the way like Ben Odenkirk in Better Call Saul would appear if you didn't actually get to know him, right? Anyway, what's interesting about this guy, he asked me out, and I turned him down because I thought he was boring. And he was a nice-looking guy. Again, he was nice-looking, smart, but I just thought he was so boring. And so anyway, sometime later, years later, and this was in, I guess now we're getting into my early 30s, and I was going through a particularly hard time in life and a lot of problems, was that were self-caused and just difficulties and whatever, right? And life just felt very, very complicated. I mean, it still feels complicated, but it felt very complicated, and I felt very sort of like stuck in all these things, these problems that I created myself. Anyway, the guy that I was dating right at that point, he'd always wanted a banjo. It's the guy that I'm with now. But he had mentioned something about wanting a banjo, and so this boring guy, this old friend of mine, turns out I found out somehow that he had a banjo, an old banjo that he was selling, and we lived in sort of the same place, and he agreed that if I came over and got the banjo, he would just give it to me for free, just like a nice thing, because he didn't have use for it anymore, and he was going to get rid of it. So long story short, I go to this guy's house. Now this is the boring guy, and the boring guy, I hate to keep calling him that, but you'll see in a minute, has a point. And the nice boring guy lived with his nice boring family in the nice boring suburbs. And so I was going to go out to their house and I was going to meet his wife and his kids, and because I hadn't seen him in years and so much had happened and whatever, I was going to, say hi to them, and I was going to grab the banjo. So I go into his house and, meet him and his wife and his kids, and everything about the situation, about the house, about the wife, about the children, about the atmosphere, about my old friend, it all seemed just so nice and boring. Like, she seemed just as nice and boring as he did. The kids seemed nice and boring. Everything was just so nice and sweet and wholesome. Wholesome. Wholesome is the word I'm looking for. And simple, And so anyway, I got the banjo and I said goodbye, and I went out to my car and I sat in my car and I put the banjo down, sat in the car, closed the doors. And I remember I put my head on the steering wheel, and I don't know if I cried or if I just kind of sighed and just sat there like this with my head on the steering wheel. But what I distinctly remember thinking, and it's like one of those flashbulb memories, so it must have really made an impression on me. I guess I was, for some reason. But what I remember thinking is, I wish that I were a simple, person who could be satisfied with simple things and a simple life like this guy. Look at this. He's got this simple outlook. He's got this wholesome family and this wholesome wife and the 2 kids and the dog and the house and all. Like, why can't I want these things? Why can't I be satisfied with these things or seek out a simple life? Why am I always like complicating everything? What's wrong with me? You know, and I just remember just sitting there in my head on the steering wheel thinking, why can't I be simple like this? Simple and happy, wholesome like these people. Come to find out, a couple of years later, this guy ends up getting a divorce because guess what? He had not only gone through his entire life savings, but he'd gone through his wife's life savings and all of their family money and their kids' college fund. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on escorts and strippers. And I remember I heard that, and he's better now. Like, he went through therapy, rehab, counseling, got a divorce. I mean, God, the whole thing, the whole shebang, right? The whole. But I remember when I heard about that, a mutual friend told us, and my first response was, whoa. And then almost immediately what I remembered was sitting in his driveway, crying, my head on the steering wheel, thinking, why can't I have a simple, easy, wholesome life like this guy? So what does that tell you? Take from that what you will. Anyway, I think back to that a lot, and I get a good laugh out of it. And I think that tells you a lot about life and a lot about the assumptions that we have about each other that are not even true.